Carl Jung published his book Psychological Types in 1921, introducing 4 functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, as well as the 2 attitudes through which these functions are deployed: introversion and extroversion. If one of these functions habitually predominates, it is called our primary or dominant function, which is paired with a secondary or auxiliary function. Jung taught us that a rational function, thinking or feeling, is paired with an irrational function, sensation or intuition, to develop a conscious orientation, or, as he put it, an ego consciousness, involving just these 2 differentiated functions. On the other hand, the tertiary function is less differentiated, that is, less within our conscious grasp, while the inferior function is entirely immersed in the unconscious, becoming a source of errors and complexes. However, it also provides the bridge to the self, the total personality, that the other differentiated functions cannot. The inferior function is carried by the anima or animus, contrasexual archetypes of the soul that can serve as tutelary figures, representing the otherness of the unconscious. They allow a relationship to develop between conscious and unconscious contents, with the potential to replace the tension of opposites with the harmony of wholeness. The tertiary and inferior functions would, in most people, remain potentials only and are often represented in dreams in archaic ways. However, in the second half of life, they press for integration into consciousness to balance our one-sidedness and allow for wholeness. The lifelong task of individuation. If you are unfamiliar with these concepts or need a refresher, it is recommended that you watch the previous video, The Psychology of Personality Types. Jung's functions follow a 4-fold structure, typical of the archetype of the self. These functions align with the archetypal patterns of the 4 classical elements: air, thinking; water's feeling; earth, sensation; and fire's intuition. The self is the quintessence, the 5th element, which unites all the elements, or all forms of consciousness. We are dealing with the archetype of the differentiation of consciousness, which helps you become who you are meant to be. But for that, we must go beyond simple identification, something few of us truly do. Most of us live as if we were simply our parents' son or daughter, husband or wife, disciple, and so on. In other words, people live their complexes as if they were reality. If we are to embark on the journey toward consciousness, we must break free from these identifications. For many, the psychological nature is as yet unborn. Each of us is born into a particular family and culture, shaped by a typological bias, and we quickly learn that failing to meet the expectations and demands of others can lead to serious consequences. In a way, unless we are fortunate enough to be born into a family that aligns well with our natural type, we all make a Faustian bargain in childhood, trading our true, innate nature for power, knowledge, and material gain, and we pay an enormous price for that later in life. Psychological types have to do with discovering one's own unique orientation, something that can only emerge after sufficient disorientation. It is not merely a framework for casually labeling others from the outside. To do so would entirely miss its true purpose. Psychological types make sense of the way one follows one's individuation process, but they do not account for the many distortions of type that arise from substituting other functions to satisfy or defend against the type demands of an environment that hinders individuation. One may appear very successful on the outside, but, in reality, suffer from inner fragmentation. The persona, or social mask, a collective way of playing a role in the world, may have nothing to do with one's true nature. It is also best not to make a type diagnosis for someone who has not yet made a connection to the self that would be natural to them, because all you may be doing is noticing the negative personality that has swallowed up the patient's true self. When neurotic traits are easily diagnosed in a patient, it suggests that what is being observed is not the person's natural personality, but rather a falsification of the original personality. What does consciousness mean? It isn't simply being non-comatose, although that does help. In a seminar, Jung was asked, as not individuation, in our sense of the word here, rather living life consciously. A plant individuates, but it lives unconsciously. Jung's answer was, that is our form of individuation. A plant that is meant to produce a flower is not individuated. If it does not produce a flower, it must fulfill the cycle. And the man who does not develop consciousness is not individuated, because consciousness is his flower, it is his life. It belongs to our process of individuation that we shall become conscious, by allowing the subtitle of psychological types to be the psychology of individuation. Jung implied that the flowering of consciousness has something to do with the progressive emergence of psychological types. Just as a flower represents the individuation of a plant, consciousness represents the individuation of a human being. If a person individuates, fully blossoms, the various functions of consciousness become the petals of that flower. In this sense, consciousness is the human being's flower. Toward the end of his book on psychological types, Jung combined function types and attitude types to describe, in turn, 8 function attitudes. These were the psychological types in Jung's original description. However, very few of us, even among psychologists, can recognize the 8 function attitudes described by Jung. For Jung, the attitude type is primary, and the function type serves as a secondary aspect that expresses the attitude in a specific way. Accordingly, he organized his general description of the types in terms of the attitudes, describing first the peculiarities of the basic psychological functions in the extroverted attitude, and then going on to the peculiarities of the basic psychological functions in the introverted attitude. Let us briefly describe them. Extroverted types. The extroverted thinking type bases all actions on intellectual conclusions guided by objective data, whether external facts or accepted ideas. He elevates objective reality to a universal law, applying it to both personal and collective life. This embodies the entire meaning of his existence. Just as this person subordinates himself to his formula, so too does he expect others to obey it. Whoever refuses is wrong, resisting the universal law, and is therefore unreasonable, immoral, and without conscience. Extroverted thinking is interested in definitions that would hold true for everyone, according to ideas everyone might agree with. At their best, extroverted thinkers are statesmen, lawyers, practical scientists, respected academics, and successful entrepreneurs. They excel at establishing order. However, the more rigid the formula, the more such a type develops into a tyrant who forces himself and others into one mold. Activities reliant on feeling, like friendships, family time, and artistic pursuits, often suffer. Repressed potentialities eventually disturb conscious life, leading to doubt, which, when suppressed, breeds fanaticism and overcompensation for uncertainty. No function can be fully eliminated, only distorted. The more extreme a type is, the more active the unconscious becomes in compensation. In such cases, an extroverted thinking type's personal concerns, health, social standing, and family interests are sacrificed for the ideal. Sympathy fades unless others share the same ideals, with close family often seeing only tyranny, while the outside world resounds with the fame of his humanity. The extroverted feeling type is likewise oriented by objective values. This type detaches from the subjective and adjusts entirely to external influences. Something is deemed beautiful or good, not out of personal conviction, but to maintain harmony, avoid discomfort, or create a pleasant atmosphere. For example, a painting might be praised for its famous signature, or to avoid upsetting its owner, reflecting adjustment rather than insincerity. The valuations resulting from the act of feeling either correspond directly with objective values or accord with traditional and generally accepted standards. As such, they are genuine and represent the feeling function as a whole. The extroverted feeling type seeks to connect with the feelings of others, creating a shared experience by reaching out to merge in some way with the other person. This kind of feeling is largely responsible for why so many people flock to theaters, concerts, or churches. Fashions, too, owe their existence to it, as do the positive support of social, philanthropic, and other cultural institutions. Without it, a harmonious social life would be impossible. The extroverted feeling type suppresses thinking most of all, because this is the function most liable to disturb feeling. Consequently, the unconscious of this type contains thinking that is infantile, archaic, and negative. The extroverted sensation type has an exceptional grasp of reality, grounded in concrete experiences and objective facts. Their ideal is to be well adjusted to reality, and they often have compelling experiences of the textures, smells, sights, sounds, and tastes of the world. They live fully in the present, valuing tangible reality and having little patience for abstraction or reflection. They are masters at the details of life. They can read maps, navigate a strange city, keep their rooms neat and tidy, be punctual, and rarely lose things. Such types excel as engineers, editors, athletes, and business people. They make great company because they pay attention to external details, dressing well, keeping a good table with plenty of drinks for their friends, and so on. Anything that comes from inside seems morbid. Only in the realm of tangible reality can they breathe freely. Their thoughts and feelings will be explained by objective causes or the influence of others. A change in mood is unhesitatingly blamed on the weather. Psychic conflicts are unreal, nothing but imagination, an unhealthy state that will soon clear up when surrounded by friends. In extreme cases, the pursuit of sensation becomes all-consuming, and the individual develops into a crude pleasure seeker, plagued by jealous fantasies, anxiety, and every sort of phobia. The extroverted intuitive type tends to easily pick up on what is going on in the environment or in other people's minds. They also have an extraordinary ability to seek out new possibilities, new fields to conquer, and their capacity to kindle enthusiasm for anything new is unrivaled. For example, when entering an empty house, they see what can be done with the space, the walls painted in particular colors, pictures in place, and even where the furniture will go. Sensation types see only what is in front of them, while intuitives see the same scene transformed. They have absolute loyalty to their vision and submit to its authority. Such types are common among entrepreneurs, investors, bankers, gamblers, and hunters. The great danger for extroverted intuitives is that they will spend their time and energy on possibilities, particularly those of others, and never realize anything themselves. The very situations that seem to promise freedom or excitement quickly lead, once their possibilities have been exhausted, to the feeling of being imprisoned. Thus, they will leave and seek something new. Moreover, such individuals tend to pay little attention to their physical needs. They simply do not notice, for instance, when they are tired or hungry. Over time, this self-neglect can manifest in various physical illnesses. Introverted types. The introverted thinking type is strongly influenced by ideas, though they originate not in objective data, but in his subjective foundation. He follows his ideas like the extrovert, but in the reverse direction, inward, not outward. The introverted functions seek to match their experience of an object with the rich inner world of archetypal experience already present in the unconscious. Thus, one reflects on whether a particular idea really accords with one's inner truth, regardless of what others might think of it. An intense relation to objects, including people and things, is secondary or almost completely lacking in every introverted type. Simply not pathologizing introversion, seeing it not as an unhealthy and dysfunctional way to adapt to the world, may be one of the most healing things a psychologist can do. An introverted thinker often struggles to know when to stop and feels the need to redefine everything from scratch, to the point that it becomes exhausting and hard to follow. Such people are typically oblivious to the objective requirements of, say, a relationship. It isn't that they don't love, but they are simply at a loss to know how to express it. Although they never shrink from thinking a thought, because it might prove dangerous or wound others' feelings, they are nonetheless beset by the greatest anxiety if they must make it an objective reality. In the pursuit of his ideas, the introverted thinker is generally stubborn. He lets himself be exploited if only he can be left in peace to pursue his ideas. However, he will burst out with vicious, personal retorts against every criticism, however just. Casual acquaintances think him inconsiderate and domineering. To outsiders, he seems prickly, unapproachable, and arrogant. But the better one knows him, the more favorable one's judgment becomes, and his closest friends value his intimacy very highly. The introverted thinking type is the proverbial, absent-minded professor. This can be quite charming, but less so the more he becomes single-mindedly attached to his own ideas or inner images. Then his convictions become rigid and unbending, his judgment cold, inflexible, and arbitrary. In the extreme case, he may lose all connection with objective reality and become isolated from friends, family, and colleagues. The introverted feeling type tends to have a calm appearance behind which there may be considerable inner emotion, character, or intellect. Still waters run deep is very true of such people. They are mostly silent, inaccessible, and hard to understand. Often, they hide behind a childish mask, and their temperament is inclined to melancholy. As they are mainly guided by their subjective feelings, they are concerned with values that matter most to themselves, and their true motives generally remain hidden. People of this type neither shine nor reveal themselves. Their lack of desire to impress or influence others sometimes arouses suspicion of indifference and coldness on the one hand, and stupidity on the other. Wordless expression is a common feature of such people. They are more interested in solving an underlying, feeling problem than in making communications to address people's expressions of discomfort triggered by the problem. Extroverted feeling, by contrast, tends to be more communicative, using a stream of reassuring words to put people at ease. Since introverted feeling types appear reserved, it might seem on a superficial view that such people, paradoxically, have no feelings at all. The feeling of such a person may express itself in a secret religiosity anxiously guarded from others, or in intimate poetic forms that are kept equally well hidden, not without the secret ambition of displaying some kind of superiority over the other person by this means. The secret feelings are sensed as a sort of stifling presence that holds everyone nearby under a spell. This presence carries a mysterious power that can prove terribly fascinating to an extroverted individual, especially a thinking type, as it resonates deeply with the unconscious. This type has a primitive and inferior thinking that tends to be reductive and concrete. Introverted feeling types often have a heightened sensitivity to what other people think, frequently perceiving others as harboring negative thoughts, scheming, or plotting against them. This leads to fatigue, stress, restlessness, and irritability. Over time, their deep emotional intensity can deteriorate into a superficial and excessive need for control, expressed through vanity and authoritarian dominance. The introverted sensation type is guided by the intensity of the subjective sensation excited by the objective stimulus. For instance, when somebody comes into the room, he notices the way the person enters, the expression on their face, their clothes. Every detail is absorbed. Outwardly, the introverted sensation type looks like a piece of wood with no reaction at all, and you do not know what is going on within him. But inwardly the impression is being absorbed. The quicker inner reactions go on underneath, and the outer reaction comes in a delayed way. These are the people who, if told a joke, are likely the last to laugh. Introverted sensation concerns itself primarily with finding order, organizing experience, and monitoring the comfort of the body on the inside, seeking to avoid overstimulation, overheating, exhaustion, hunger, or consuming the wrong foods. Such a type may appear as calm and passive or capable of rational self-control. However, this is really due to his unrelatedness to objects. Normally, the object is not consciously devalued in the least, but its stimulus is removed from it and immediately replaced by a subjective reaction no longer related to the reality of the object. Such a person can easily make one question why one should exist at all, or why objects in general should have any justification for their existence, since everything essential still goes on happening without them. Seen from the outside, it looks as though the effect of the object does not penetrate into the subject at all. In extreme cases, the subject has an illusory conception of reality that goes so far that he is no longer able to distinguish between the real object and the subjective perception. Since his unconscious is distinguished chiefly by the repression of intuition, this type lives in a mythological world, where people, houses, mountains, rivers, and things appear either as benevolent deities or as malevolent demons. The introverted intuitive type, like the extroverted intuitive, senses future possibilities and potential outcomes, but focuses inward. These individuals look at the big picture in the unconscious, the collective unconscious. where the archetypal patterns that move nations, religions, and epochs lay, even in the midst of apparently individual experiences. They often appear as seers, prophets, poets, artists, or shamans. As an artist, the individual reveals strange, beautiful, and whimsical things in his work. If not an artist, he is often a misunderstood genius. On a more mundane level, such people are mystical daydreamers who struggle to communicate, are often misunderstood, lack self-awareness, and accomplish little. They move between images and possibilities, lost in the unconscious without forming personal connections. They are especially liable to neglect ordinary physical needs, and often have little awareness of their own bodily existence or its effect on others. To extroverts, they may seem detached from reality, lost in fruitless fantasies. Introverted intuitives are vague about real-world details, prone to getting lost, missing appointments, and being late. Their lack of bodily awareness also makes them inattentive lovers. What the introverted intuitive represses most of all is the sensation of the object, and this colors his whole unconscious. It gives rise to a compensatory extroverted sensation of an archaic character, manifesting as compulsive neurosis with hypochondriacal symptoms, hypersensitivity of the sense organs, and obsessive attachments to certain people or objects. Jung acknowledges that although both the introverted intuitive and the introverted sensation type are, from an extroverted and rationalistic standpoint, indeed the most useless of men, the way they function is nevertheless instructive. They are living evidence that this rich and varied world with its overflowing and intoxicating life is not purely external, but also exists within. In their own way, these people are the educators and promoters of culture. Their life teaches more than their words. For Jung, the introverted intuitive is the most difficult type because he sees such uncommon things that he does not like to talk about them. And if he does, he is bound to be misunderstood. The introverted intuitive has one of the most difficult lives, but also one of the most interesting ones. The 8 function, attitudes in everyday life in Darrell Sharp's book, Personality Types, Jung's model of typology. He describes the 8 different types of consciousness personified as guests at a dinner party. The hostess, appropriate to her role, embodies extroverted feeling, ensuring the gathering runs smoothly. Her husband, a quiet, slender professor of art history, excels at distinguishing subtle details in artwork. He represents introverted sensation. An extroverted thinking lawyer is the first guest to arrive. An industrialist, well-dressed but loud, and a greedy though appreciative eater comes later. He stands for extroverted sensation. His wife, a quiet and reserved woman with mysterious eyes, exerts a strangely magnetic effect on the other guests with her introverted feeling. An introverted thinking professor of medicine arrives next, absorbed in thoughts of his latest research, seemingly detached from the social atmosphere. He is followed by an extroverted intuitive engineer, who enthusiastically discusses his ambitious plans, which one suspects will come to fruition only if someone else carries them out. While speaking, he gobbles down his food without noticing what he is eating. The final intended guest, a young and poor poet, forgets to attend entirely. Upon realizing his mistake, he plans by way of apology to send the hostess a poem he was working on while the party was taking place, embodying the dreamy nature of the introverted intuitive. John Beebe's expansion on Jung's typology in his book, Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type. American psychiatrist and Jungian psychologist John Beebe expands on Jung's work on types. If the dominant function is extroverted, for instance, the traditional Jungian model would consider the auxiliary and tertiary functions extroverted too, meaning the only introverted function would be the inferior one. In Beebe's model, however, he considers all 8 forms of consciousness as part of our single, individual psyche. It is the effects of consciousness on personality, not types of personality. If the primary function is introverted, then the auxiliary will be extroverted, and vice versa. This natural alternation in our functions of consciousness is very adaptive. It keeps us from being too one-sided. The 8-function model is not purely theoretical. It emerged from Beebe's extensive study of his own dreams, fantasies, and behaviors, as well as those of his patients, drawing on over 50 years of experience in psychotherapy. Beebe came upon a fourfold shadow structure that complements the conscious counterparts, but is generally more negative and destructive in nature. Only through direct experience of the types as one's own can one benefit from type theory. Otherwise, it merely becomes another way to learn from others about one's identity. While there can still be value in discovering new energy for adaptation, it is not the same as individuation. Jung had emphasized that the theory of psychological types should be used not as a way of classifying people but for sorting out the empirical material in therapy. This approach helps a patient identify where a particular complex lives in the psyche. When analyzing a dream figure, it is useful to consider its type. In psychotherapy, a patient's issue may be described as a thinking, feeling, intuitive, or sensation problem. The goal is to match the appropriate function of consciousness to the situation. From this perspective, the development of consciousness involves the ability to summon the different functions at the right moments and in the right ways. Beebe's innovation was not only to extend the fourfold model to an eightfold model of personality, but also to associate an archetype with each type. Jung had compared the inferior function with the anima or animus. Beebe gave an adequate name to the rest. To give an example of the eightfold model, let us consider Jung's own type, introverted thinking intuitive. Primary function, heroinid introverted thinking secondary function, father-mother. Extroverted intuition tertiary function, puer atenus, puella atena. Introverted sensation inferior function au anima animus. Extroverted feeling. These four archetypes belong to the ego, syntonic aspect of consciousness, the personality that aligns harmoniously with the needs and goals of the ego. Behind each typological position in the unfolding of consciousness, an archetype plays a role, guiding us to be heroic, parental, and even puerile and contrasexual, as part of what makes us capable of becoming aware of ourselves and the world around us. These four archetypes belong to one's mostly conscious orientation, which Beebe calls the little s self. This is the typology of one's everyday self-experience, the basis of one's ongoing consciousness as a person having one's own standpoint with its inevitable strengths and weaknesses. As for the other four function attitudes, we enter the realm of the shadow, or what Beebe refers to as the ego, dystonic or ego alien personality. This aspect develops in opposition to the ego and often appears disruptive or destructive to the ego's goals. The shadow is repressed because it is felt to be incompatible with a person's moral values, holding on to feelings, motives, and desires deemed unworthy. Since it's not accepted as part of oneself, the shadow can act autonomously, sometimes breaking free from repression to express the very impulses the ego has rejected. Watch what you hate, it's pure gold. Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz writes, Jung had said that the hardest thing to understand is not your opposite type. If you have introverted feeling, it is very difficult to understand an extroverted type, but the same functional type with the other attitude. It would be most difficult for an introverted feeling type to understand an extroverted feeling type. Such people remain to a great extent a puzzle and are very difficult to understand spontaneously. Here the theory of types is tremendously important practically, for it is the only thing which can prevent one from completely misunderstanding certain people. Beebe applied this idea to the situation within a single psyche, in which the antagonism is not between two people but between two functions with opposite attitudes, seeking to express themselves within the same person. In this context, the shadow refers to having the same function, but the opposite attitude. Continuing with Jung's own type as an example, opposing personality, shadow of the heroed extroverted thinking senex witch, shadow of the parent introverted intuition, trickster shadow of the puer, extroverted sensation demonic personality, shadow of the animite, introverted feeling. The superior hero and inferior anima animus functions form a vertical axis, which Beebe calls the spine of personality. This is the axis of our relation to self, which forms the core of our personality and allows us to know who we truly are. It establishes both our greatest strengths and greatest weaknesses. Integrity comes not only from having appropriate pride in your strengths, but also in accepting your weaknesses and holding that tension of opposites. The auxiliary and tertiary functions have a horizontal axis, called the arms of personality. This is the axis of our relation to others, which is focused on how we care for others and are cared for by them. Some people define their whole lives according to the arms of personality and have little curiosity as to who they are, but they are greatly concerned about how they treat others and are treated by them. The 8 archetypes in depth. Let us now briefly look into each archetype. The hero-heroine represents the superior function of consciousness, the archetypal image for the development of the ego or self-identity, beginning in early childhood, associated with strength and pride, competence, and potential mastery, initiates individuation. The hero welcomes life's challenges and takes responsibility to confront them, requires autonomy and separation from excessive superego expectations. However, excessive identification leads to a superiority complex and ego inflation. The father-mother belongs to the auxiliary function, behaving like a nurturing parent, concerned with fostering, protecting, and mentoring. In men, the lack of fatherly energy transmission creates a hunger for older male figures. The archetype goes beyond the physical father. It includes the knowledge about fatherhood passed down. A man's masculinity is tied to how potent or impotent he feels in having something valuable to impart. The puer atenus puella eternus eternal child represents the tertiary function, characterized by immaturity and play. Like the left hand of a right-handed person, sometimes creative but unstable, exhibits false individualism, seeing no need to adapt, struggles with commitment, always finding a but that prevents real engagement, can also bring energy, beauty, and creativity into adult life. The anima animus tied to the inferior function, often a source of shame. Acknowledging this shame with humility is crucial for self-knowledge. Jung calls the anima the archetype of life because it gives a man the feeling of being alive, acts as a gateway to the unconscious, a mediatrix to the self. Symptoms like bad moods, resentment, and emotional outbursts signal faulty adaptation to the inner world. The opposing personality, the shadow of the hero, an area of frustration and challenge, fuels defensive traits like paranoia, avoidance, and passive aggressiveness. When constellated, it makes us feel our heroic function is under attack, can oppose one's own best interests in perverse ways, often projected onto others who seem antagonistic. The Senex witch, the shadow of the good father-mother, characterized by limit, setting, control, and cynicism. The Senex is paralyzing to a woman's animus, while the witch disables a man's anima, represents the withering self-critic that drains vitality. In extreme cases, leads to depressive delusions of meaninglessness. The trickster, the shadow of the poor puella, represents manipulation, mischief, and paradox, resists rules and defies conventional standards. In therapy, appears as patients who undercut psychological understanding, creates double binds, situations where you can't win. The demonic personality, the shadow of the anima animus, undermines oneself and others in surprising, destructive ways. When unaddressed, the inferior function is vulnerable to this aspect, can transform into a daemon's guiding spirit with integration.